that we may have known, and I've asked him to say a little bit about Andersonville Prison, because we were shocked when we found out how many people from Jackson County ended up in that very horrible prison, Confederate prison in Georgia. So, okay. I just want you to know how much I appreciate Ray coming to do this for us. He comes all the way from Wisconsin, and it's just wonderful to have him, especially at a time like this when we're really busy, that he would come and do that for us. So thank you to Ray.
Happy to be here.
Oh, Ray, I forgot. Thank you. I'm so excited. I'm sorry. And, okay, we are singing happy birthday. First to Roberta over here.
To Dixie, but do not look at her, please.
Look at me because I look.
Do not look at her.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Dixie. Happy birthday to you.
Nobody looked, right? Nobody looked. And is Nadine here?
Yes.
Happy birthday to Nadine, and you can look at Nadine. Happy birthday to Nadine.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Nadine. Happy birthday to
And Ray Scott.
So as I was saying, I put this program together to help out with the event happening this weekend. This is a forerunner to Muster on the Maquoketa. And my thoughts were that we know about the battles of the Civil War, but we hardly have ever talked about the other battle that happened during the Civil War of so many prisoners of war on both sides of the war. And this is part of their story. So the flag you see in front of here, this is the American flag as it was in 1860, when we had 34 states of the Union, of which this war was trying to preserve.
I jinxed it.
We're fine. We're just going to start over again. That was the opening scene.
you.
happened this weekend between the two generals of this war. Notice the pictures changed. This was easy reenactors this weekend. So this program today is going to talk about the prisons. I found this video to be very appealing and informational, educational, so please enjoy watching this.
Hey mister, what did you do in the war? Did you shoot down your brothers in a hail of gunfire? Did you pray with your musket in the brush and the briar? Did you scream from the bloodshed that never tired? Hey mister, what was it all for? It was a crazy, 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 crazy war.
When the last shell burst over Fort Sumter, the harsh reality of a civil war confronted a divided American republic mired in dispute. A growing nation still in its infancy braced for war and an uncertain future. The stark differences separating the northern and southern states ignited a conflict so devastating that nearly every family mourned a loved one. For the next 4 years, two amateur armies mauled each other, leaving America's landscape awash in the blood of her finest young men. In 1861, all the heated rhetoric over slavery, bellowing from fiery politicians, faded as the drumbeat for war grew louder in a fractured nation moving closer to ruin. Futile attempts at compromise spanning decades demanded that the matter be immediately shifted from the legislative halls to the field of battle for a resolution. War fever infected the country, sweeping through every town and hamlet into the farthest reaches of America. Recruiting halls overflowed with eager young men from all walks of life, willing to lay down the tools of their trade and pick up a musket to fight for a cause. Idealistic volunteers infused with patriotic fervor signed on for a crusade, never suspecting the magnitude of the severe trials that awaited. Thoughts of glory and adventure overshadowed the grim realities of warfare. Newly crowned civilian soldiers bid farewell to friends, kissed their families goodbye, marched off to war, and many simply vanished, never to be seen or heard from again. A call to arms was answered in force. Factories in both sectors of America ramped up production of muskets, swords, and cannon, all for the express purpose of killing each other. But with all the hasty preparations for waging war, neither side gave much thought to capturing and holding large numbers of prisoners. The prevailing belief of a short war dismissed any long-term plans for confinement. As a result, thousands of captured soldiers suffered dearly for the lack of foresight on the part of generals, whose primary focus was victory on the battlefield. For the captured soldier, another, more deadly war was about to begin. Food, water, and shelter often proved to be luxuries in many of the camps. Any soldier captured now faced his toughest battle of the war against the unrelenting adversaries of starvation, exposure, and disease. A soldier's odds of surviving battle far surpassed his chances of walking out of prison alive. Musket balls and artillery shells posed much less danger than a Civil War prison. Loyal young men who freely volunteered when their respective nations called now realized that their leaders had abandoned them in captivity. No help was on the way. Left to die, soldiers on both sides cursed the governments they swore to uphold. Earnest negotiations to resume the exchange never took place after Grant assumed overall command in March of 1864. Any negotiating was purely theatrical for the families back home, clamoring for an exchange of captured loved ones. Eventually, the underlying reason for the failure to exchange prisoners emerged when the North recognized their huge advantage in manpower. A war of attrition favored the North. The North had a deeper well of citizens to replace their captured soldiers. In the South, the pool for potential soldiers was running dry. A fixed plan in the North determined that rebel prisoners remain captive and not be returned to Southern soil until the conclusion of the war. By neglecting to renew the exchange, the belligerent nations set the stage for one of the greatest tragedies in American history. Any hope of rescue gave way to despair for prisoners, wallowing in deplorable conditions that only worsened as the war dragged on. Exchange was dead. Angry rebel prisoners up north resented Richmond placing more value on their blacks than on their own soldiers. In the North, Grant, Stanton, and the Lincoln administration concluded that their soldiers imprisoned down south were expendable. If they had to languish and die in prison for a perceived advantage in numbers, so be it. Little consideration or worth was given to soldiers no longer under arms and unable to fight. These cruel policies, valuing ideology over humanity, condemned thousands of innocent and helpless prisoners to an early grave. Chief of Staff, Union General Henry Halleck stated,
"To exchange their healthy men for ours who are on the brink of the grave from their hellish treatment, of course, gives them the advantage."
The advantages in warfare always reigned supreme for generals plotting strategy. The plight of the prisoners gained little sympathy among the military elite. Grant, noting the ill health of Northern prisoners, took a similar view as Halleck in a letter to Stanton when he wrote,
"Exchange simply reinforces the enemy at once, while we get no benefit from the soldiers we receive for 3 months and lose the majority entirely."
No longer of any benefit to the Army, volunteers who came running when Father Abraham called now felt discarded. Concern for prisoners differed little in the South. The war had a devastating effect on the South's ability to feed their own people. Major cities down south continually dealt with food riots involving frustrated citizens. Although lacking resources, a heartless attitude was evident. When Richmond was advised of food shortages plaguing Union prisoners in Southern camps, an indifferent Commissary General Lucius Northrop declared,
"It is just that those who cause the scarcity be the first to suffer from it."
And the suffering ensued in spades. Prison populations exploded in 1864, well beyond the capacity to care for them. The spring campaigns brought thousands more into already crowded prisons. The South, depleted of supplies, had little food, clothing, or medicine for sick and hungry prisoners in torn and tattered clothes. Yet they held them anyway despite the recognized rules of war, which state that if you can't provide the basic necessities of life for your captives, you're obliged to release them. Unable to provide the essentials to sustain life, the Confederate High Command stood by, oblivious to the surging death toll. In Washington, officials believed the mistreatment of Union prisoners was intentional, so Stanton ordered retaliation against Confederate prisoners by withholding food, clothing, and medicine from soldiers held in areas of the country overflowing with ample provisions. Shirking their own responsibility, the North intentionally inflicted unnecessary misery and death among Southern prisoners. A perverted strategy demanded the Confederate prisoners remain captive till victory was secured, while ignoring their own rapidly dying Union men held down south. An indifferent South, coupled with a vindictive North, brought untold suffering to prisoners waiting for diplomatic efforts to bring them home. Devoted young soldiers, North and South, whose only offense was volunteering to support their nation of choice, yearned for home and began doubting if they would ever see their families again. The year 1864 was especially severe, as prisoners surrendered life in alarming numbers to starvation and diseases so indiscriminately racing through all the prisons. Soldiers, strong and vibrant before capture, slowly wasted away under intolerably harsh conditions. For prisoners racked with debilitating disease, whose demise was certain, death seemed an act of mercy. Wagons carried the dead away in droves. A steady procession of emaciated cadavers to the burial pits challenged grave diggers to keep pace with the soaring mortality. The dark underbelly of the Civil War was emerging with little fanfare in Washington or Richmond. An agreement for exchanging prisoners proved elusive until the final months of the war, when the issue was all but decided. For countless boys already decaying in the trenches, it came too late. The tremendous loss of life in Civil War prisons remains to this day a sad and controversial chapter of the war. From the 420,000 soldiers held captive during the war, starvation and neglect killed 30,000 Yankees and 26,000 Confederate soldiers. Most historians believe the agreed-upon figure of 56,000 prison dead to be grossly underreported. The official number excludes those barely clinging to life who expired in hospital shortly after release from prison. Also absent from the list of prison dead are the prisoners whose lifeless bodies emerged by the hundreds from the hospital ships and rail cars before ever reaching home. They died free men, but an inhumane prison sealed their fate. And many laid their bones in community churchyards and local cemeteries only weeks or months after arriving home. An accurate number of soldiers who perished as a direct result of their prison experience is unknown and probably staggering. Amid the furious battles raging in the spring of 1864, thousands of newly captured soldiers from both armies surrendered their freedom and marched at the point of a bayonet to the rear of the enemy lines. After a long journey into the northern or southern heartland, prisoners entered already congested prisons, unable to handle a new influx of prisoners. More prisoners required immediate action for new prisons. In the North, it was decided that another Union training facility in Elmira, New York, could be altered into a prison to accommodate the excess of Confederate captives. The choice for the South, a new stockade cut from a pine forest in southwest Georgia near the small hamlet of Anderson, accepted the bulk of the Union prisoners. Both Elmira Prison and the Andersonville Stockade would be remembered as appalling death camps, known for their deprivations and flagrant loss of life. The Elmira Military Prison undoubtedly ranks as the absolute worst prison in the North. Frequently compared to Andersonville, it was considerably smaller but still registered a deplorable 25% death rate in less than a year. When the camp opened in July 1864, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had already set in motion his vindictive policy of retaliating against the Southern prisoners for the perceived mistreatment of Union prisoners in the Southern camps. By cutting rations to meager portions, delaying medicines, and withholding clothing, the dying among the Southerners accelerated not only at Elmira, but in all the northern prisons. In total accord with Stanton was Commissary General of Prisoners Colonel William Hoffman, who earlier gave the following directive to his commandants.
So long as a prisoner has clothes on his back, no matter how torn or ragged, you will issue him nothing.
After the war, the frugal Hoffman returned a total of $1.8 million to the War Department in unused funds initially allocated for the care of Confederate prisoners.
So it was an eye-opener for me. I did not remember the prisons in my high school history classes I hope the second half of that will be done later in the presentation. So, fast forward to 1996, brought attention to the fact that my own family had served in the Civil War. And this, of course, is a family reunion that we held at Maquoketa Fairgrounds, and this is in front of what we now know as Irvin Penningross Machine Shed. And at that reunion, we had a skit done, and Irvin Penningross wrote these stories of the members of our Scott family that were affected by this Civil War. And so this woman is Holly Skinner Scott, and she had 3 members of her family affected by the Civil War. The first one was Amanda, William, David, and Lucinda. The women, Amanda Cook Atherton was the first one, and she married John Wilson Cook. And they had 3 children before he went off to the Civil War, and he never returned home. He's buried in the Greenlawn Cemetery in Franklin County, Ohio. The second person in the Scott family that was affected was Lucinda Scott. Now, she actually died before the Civil War started, but her husband went on to remarry. His name was McCollum Russell. And before she died, she had given birth to twin boy and girl, who then had to be raised by other people in the Scott family or raised by McCollum Russell's second wife. So he too left Iowa. Then the one most notably that came from Baldwin was William W. Scott. And Ergen wrote quite a story about him because, as the picture shows, he died at the age of 18. He was injured in the war, came back to Davenport, and he died in the Davenport Hospital of his injuries, and he was laid to rest in the Penn Cemetery. And Ergen made sure when we did this reunion that he had a monument from the Army, so that's where the plaque on the ground you see was given through the donations of that reunion. So in Ergen's writing, none of us will ever forget the arrival of the events of the day. The great battle of Shiloh had begun, and as we left the boat, we could hear the roar of the cannons. We saw many wounded already arriving at the docks for transport and heard universal reports of a Union defeat at all points of this battle. We were sent forward with great dread to reinforce our lines, which we did for over an hour until ordered to retreat. That brief period of the front took its toll, which included some of our own Jackson County men who were wounded. Among them were John Redden, who wounded severely enough to cause his discharge from the Army. Others were Simon Drake, William Scheib, Isaac Zook from Fremont, and Solomon Zook and John Wood from Mill Rock, or what is now Baldwin. On April 27th, a new brigade was formed of the 11th, 13th, 15th, and 16th Regiments of Iowa Infantry under the commander of Colonel Crocker. This unit remained intact until the war's end, became known widely as Crocker's Iowa Brigade. I was proud to be a member of this unit. We were next sent to Corinth, Mississippi, which had been abandoned by the rebel troops. We were in camp at Corinth until July 28th. While we were there, several of our local boys died. William, Elsie, and Aaron Corbin from Canton, and Charles Brock from Buckhorn died in June. David Gates and Franklin Harris both died from Mill Rock in July. Our regiment started out with 350 men, of which 14 were killed, 48 wounded, and 14 missing or captured in action. Jackson County, again, we lost Solomon Zook, who had already been wounded at Shiloh, John Robbins. In January, deserted from a hospital steamer while being transported from Memphis to Vicksburg. I guess he just decided that enough was enough. So you can see Bergen had quite a bit of history about this. The next person from the Scott family, there were actually two. There were two young boys who had not yet turned the age of 16, had been turned away from the Iowa regiments for enlistment. But when they came back to Baldwin, they returned back to the state of Illinois, and all of a sudden they were 18 years old. And they enlisted into the Army. One was Jim Skinner, and the other one is David Scott, and they were first cousins. And David Scott Jr. was the last person born of Holly Skinner, and he went to avenge his brother's death. And so, let's see. With revenge in mind, I snuck off with my friend James Skinner and volunteered for duty, even though neither of us was of legal age. They mustered us in Davenport, even though I applied in Illinois. I was only 17 and claimed to be 18. Company records described me as being 5'8" tall, fair complected with light hair and gray eyes. We were sure we would kill a few of those Rebs. So he had revenge on his mind. One thing that came out of this reunion of David Scott was the fact that he never served in the capacity to be on the front lines for the short 100-day service. But what he did do was he became a drummer boy. And I'd like to read that. The Civil War, sometimes called the Boys' War, because so many soldiers who fought were still in their teens. The rule in the Union Army was that soldiers had to be 18. Many were younger boys answered, "I'm over 18," when the recruiter asked. So there's the true story I found in this. Many of the youngest boys served as drummers. They weren't supposed to be fighters, but they did a very important job during the Civil War. You've probably seen pictures of a boy walking beside marching soldiers, beating his drum to keep them together. But this wasn't the drummer's most important or most difficult job. In the noise and confusion of battle, it was often impossible to hear officers' orders, so each order was given a series of drum beats to represent it. Both soldiers and drummers had to learn which drum roll meant "meet here," and which meant "attack now," which meant "retreat," and all the other commands of battlefield and camp. The most exciting drum roll was the long roll, which was the signal to attack. The drummer would just beat, 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 and every other drummer in hearing distance would beat, 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 until all that could be heard was an overwhelming thunder pushing the army forward. When the drummer boys weren't needed for sounding the calls, they had another job. They were stretcher bearers. They walked around the battlefield looking for the wounded and brought them to medical care. Many young boys marched off to war looking for adventure, but they found hard, dangerous work along with it. 26 or 27 different cadences that were learned to be played at the time of the Civil War. And I can only imagine what David Scott contributed. In our own Jackson County Museum, you will find David Scott's Civil War drum. It was donated to the museum after the final day of the Scott reunion, when David Scott's descendants banded together to present that drum to the museum to stay here in Jackson County.
Okay, so we just got in here, and oh my gosh, the temperature is so much more pleasant in here than it is out there. But this is the Drummer Boy Museum, so we're going to kind of take a look around and see what we can learn. Now, as you're entering the museum here, of course, we are in Andersonville, so they really have this incredible diorama showing the Andersonville prison. So this is similar to what it would have looked like. Of course, in the prior videos, it was just field that we were looking at, but here you can see like the camp tents, you can see that swamp in the middle, and then all the little, what they call pigeon roosts or guard towers on the outside. Wow, that is really well done. And oh my goodness, guns, 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 all from the Civil War. Very, very cool. Oh, look at this. Here are 2 bullets right here that were found fused together at Gettysburg. That is really interesting. To me, one of the most horrifying pieces of weaponry in the Civil War was something called grape shot. And they were these like little miniature cannonballs that were loaded into cannons and then shot out like a just evil shotgun. And here they have some grape shot here. And they also have a Confederate grape shot mold. I've never seen one of those before. You know what? For such a small museum, this place really does have all kinds of things that I've never seen before, such as cigars from the Civil War. Now, here's something awful that we've seen before, a surgeon's amputation saw, but here's something that we haven't seen, a dadgum piece of a jawbone with a bullet lodged in it. Oh my gosh. Here's something else that's kind of interesting. This is a hospital bullet with teeth marks in it, so I guess they would give these to the patients to bite down on for the pain. My gosh. Here they have a bunch of different uniforms of the Civil War. So here would be a Union artillery officer, and they have somebody representing the U.S. colored troops, so holding a ramrod there. And of course this is the Drummer Boy Museum, so naturally you have to have a drummer boy. Most of the time these kids were 15, 16 years old. The Civil War was the last time that we had a conflict that involved drummer boys. Again, I just can't get over all of the interesting things they have here. There's a U.S. Cavalry branding iron, some items found at Bull Run. Here's a 9th New York breastplate, spurs found at Gettysburg, just all kinds of things here. Oh my gosh, I would love, love, love to have a powder keg filled with Civil War mini balls. Look at that. So now obviously we're looking at the Confederate section of this museum. So we have, a typical Confederate soldier here. This flag in the background, this is an original flag, and this is a modified version. The first version I think was all white and had the cross up there, but if the fold was just right, it looked like a flag of surrender. So they ended up modifying it and putting that red strip along the width. And then over here we have a Confederate drummer boy. This is called a Zouave drummer boy, so you can see that it has like the red braid and cord piping. There's all this red trim. This, as I understand, is the only known uniform like this. There might be one other. Pretty crazy.
So David Scott Jr., after he came back, lived in Baldwin, got married, had a family, and he moved to western Iowa, farmed until his health proved challenging. He moved with his youngest daughter to South Dakota, and he went to the hot springs in South Dakota to get his health returned, but he died, and he is buried in Belle Fourche, South Dakota cemetery with his wife. So now I can turn to another Scott family story. This family reunion was held in Lost Nation, and this gentleman, his wife, and this little boy made a family called Ira and Ella Whitmer Scott and their son Blaine. As this slide shows their names. And Ella Whitmer is the one where this story goes to, and her son Blaine. Ella's parents were David Whitmer and Martha Wells, excuse me. Anyway, Martha died in 1884 of a severe train, horse and buggy accident here in Maquoketa. And so Ella lost her mother and her two siblings in that train accident. But her father, David Whitmer, survived after 8 months of recuperation, and he remarried a woman named Amelia Mann. And Amelia's father was a person named Peter Jacob George Mann, who died in 1864. Does that ring a bell? He died in Andersonville prison and left his widow wife and Amelia and another sister. There were 3 more sisters. The 2 that remained in eastern Iowa we'll talk about here shortly. So the mother was Elizabeth Becker. After the Civil War, Elizabeth remarried. Before I go forward, this was a report of the people who were captured and were sent to Andersonville prison. You can see Jacob Mann is in that list. And way down here, another person we're going to talk about is Lucius Kimball Page. They happened to be captured the same day and sent to Andersonville prison. David and Amelia Mann are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, and I just thought that was interesting. They all have their roots here in Jackson County. Elizabeth Becker, her mother, married another man named John Voss, and you can see Amelia was included in their family as a stepdaughter to Elizabeth, but they went on to have more children. The bottom one, daughter, became Edith Voss, and Edith married a man, Frank Wilbur Weinbach, from Elwood. And here today to represent that lineage is my cousin Brenda. She would not be here if that action had not taken place in Andersonville Prison. That would have been a different person. Her sister was named Bertha Mann, and Bertha went on to marry a person we know, Emil Ruggeberg. And if you want to know more about that family, here in your library we have the whole story of Emil Ruggeberg in this book of all the descendants that came from Bertha Mann. This book was written by a granddaughter named Lois Ruggeberg Kellen, and that would be the daughter of Orville and Auga Ruggeberg, and also be a cousin to Thelma Scott Peoples' daughter, Pat Jenks. So that's how that all came about and related to this story. Not by direct line, but still part of the story. And here you can see pictures of Emil and Bertha Mann. And they're buried in the Lost Nation Cemetery. So again, Bertha's father died in Andersonville and is buried there. Now we're going to turn our direction to another member of my family. Platt Armstrong lived in Lost Nation after the Civil War, and he's responsible for bringing my great-great-grandmother to Lost Nation from New York. And his wife, Amanda, is my great-great-grandmother's sister. He had married two of their sisters. This was the second one, Amanda. Platt Armstrong served in the Civil War. And as you can read, he has the honor of serving his country faithfully and well during the long struggle of the 60s. He enlisted at Clinton, Iowa, under Captain Ed Wimple and Colonel Milo Smith. He was before Vicksburg until July 12, 1863, and participating in many engagements and skirmishes. He became ill, was sent to Jefferson's Barracks at St. Louis, Missouri, and then invalided there, ill, to the federal prison at Keokuk. Here, his faithful wife, who had been left with the care of 5 children during the war, came on to care for and nurse him back to health and strength. He was honorably discharged June 15, 1865. His company was attached to the 1st Brigade, 1st Division of 15th Army Corps, participated in following engagements of Chickasaw, Bayou, Arkansas Post, Deer Creek, Black Bayou, Jackson, Vicksburg, minor engagements in Clinton, Jackson, Raleigh, Brandon, etc. The company was also engaged in battles of Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, Mission Ridge, Peavine Creek, and the famous March to the Sea. He was there for the capture of Savannah at Columbia, South Carolina. He was also subsequent in the Carolina campaign and marched in the Grand Review, Washington, D.C., served there until June 12, 1865, while President Lincoln had been assassinated. And he left Lost Nation. He went out to western Iowa, found a beautiful location, farm, owned over 1,100 acres at one time. Here's its extended family. He lived to be over 89 years old. He and his wife celebrated their 63rd wedding anniversary in Lakeview, Iowa. That was the town that he founded. He came from eastern Iowa, landed in Lakeview, and that today is a resort town with a beautiful lake called Black Hawk Lake. Now we switch to another person I mentioned earlier. The initials stand for Lucius Kim Page. That happens to be Platt Armstrong's brother-in-law. He, at one time, was married to Amanda Armstrong from Lost Nation. Amanda died early in life, is buried in Lost Nation. Platt went on to again move to western Iowa. And here's the story. In my connections of family history, I came across the book. I was looking for one family, ended up finding another, Lucius Kimball Page. And his story, he was born August 26, 1844 in Ohio. This was, the writer of the book, this was her great uncle. So it's coming from her perspective. So he grew to be Great Uncle Kim, who came to visit us in Shadeland in Kingsley, Iowa, which is just south of Lamar's. This was before 1910, the year of his death. She had a very vivid memory of him, for he left deep impressions. He was a tall, big, handsome man, a veteran of the Civil War, and he thrilled me with his war experiences. Think of it, he was one of the very few Union soldiers to escape that notorious Andersonville prison in southwest Georgia. There were one time as many as 30,000 Union prisoners crowded into that log stockade that closed only 16.5 acres. More than 12,000 graves bear witness today to the frightful conditions existing there. Great Uncle Kim told me about his harrowing escape. Only a few of them made it by digging a tunnel under cover of darkness, night after night, under that stockade. Her husband Bob took on a long trip to Georgia, went to see the prison, the National Historic Site. She wanted to see where Great Uncle Kim had been. The prison area was awesome. She still has literature in her possession. Great Uncle Kim told her sister Mina, who was not very well at the time, "You will be all right. You come from hardy stock. I survived that prison." And again, Uncle Kim's first wife was Amanda Armstrong. And her father used to visit Platt Armstrong in the city of Lakeview.
Now, I thought this was extremely fascinating. We've seen the markers for the wells. There's another one over there. And apparently, digging for wells isn't the only digging that it took place here. There was up to 300 successful escapes via tunnels here at Andersonville. And here's a depiction of one of those tunnels disguised with the shebang shelter there. Gosh, I'm just amazed at the determination of some of these individuals here.
This is a picture of Kimball Page in the city of Ida Grove, Iowa. And he was awful proud of his being named a colonel of the Civil War. And before he died, he moved to the state of Oregon. And on one of his trips back to Iowa to visit family and friends, he became ill by stopping in Salt Lake City for a sandwich that he and his wife partook a dinner in, and he had a ham sandwich that caused him to have food poisoning and died. After all that, he died at the age of 65. And he's buried in Oregon, and you can see the monument there that was placed in his behalf.
Prison life is really hard for a prisoner, depending on how you were captured. If you were captured on the battlefield, you are actually coming in with less supplies than those who were captured traveling from point A to point B, or perhaps captured in the middle of the night while they're camping out. Those who are captured while traveling or camping, they actually come in with their camping supplies, and so their shelters are a bit better. But if you're captured on the battlefield, you're coming in with literally what you have on. So if you can't build up with your shelter, you obviously build down. And so this field would have been burrows in the ground. When Claire Barton comes back in 1865 to establish our national cemetery, she calls this place a field of living graves, from where the prisoners burrowed in the ground, took their jacket off and put it over the burrow just to escape the hot sun, making it a bit cooler in the ground. Now, your daily rations was cornmeal with corn cob included in the grindings. And we don't eat corn cob because our bodies can't digest it. It's too fibrous. And so people are dying from dysentery and chronic diarrhea.
So this was another story about Andersonville that had roots to Jackson County. And if you can read at the bottom of the page, there was Mike Altafish, Anton Weinschenk, Thomas Long, William Bovard, Theodore Martin, John Miller, H.G. Millman, and Charles Schmugger were some on their list. But in this article, there was one other one, was a soldier of Ezra Coder, who was also 18. And he had been mentioned in a previous brown bag lunch here a few weeks ago. You can see that Ezra Coder is in the prison war records of Andersonville along this line here. And as he was a resident of Cottonville, and there's his grave in Andersonville prison. Michael Altfish, Michael Altfish. You can read his story there. He was captured by the rebels, made a prisoner of war, sent to the hellhole of prisons, Andersonville. There he met another brave Bellevue soldier, Tony Weinschenk, who had been captured and made a prisoner of war. Tony often told us that when Mike came into the stockade, he was wearing an old silk stovepipe hat that he had picked up somewhere. He also said that Mike was then one of the brightest looking young men at Andersonville. He remained 9 months in prison when he was exchanged and sent to the Union lines and continued to serve with his regiment until June 6th of '65, receiving an honorable discharge from the Army. And Michael is buried in the Bellevue Cemetery. The other one was this Anton Weinschenk. And again, it talks about he also escaped from Andersonville prison. And another one mentioned in this story was John Cortland of Maquoketa, was a sufferer in this prison. And John is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery here in Maquoketa. William Wallace McGinnis was from Maquoketa. He was a mechanic here in town. He was in Andersonville and made it back here to live. He's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. He's actually interred in the mausoleum in the cemetery. He took part in 16 hard battles during the war. Another person I could find little information about was Theodore Martin. And he returned to Bellevue and is buried in a Bellevue cemetery. And he was a mason by trade. This is the story of Private Hippolyte Graf. He enlisted in 1862 as a private eye, 5th Iowa Cavalry. And lost an arm in Atlanta, Georgia. Remained there 4 months, 3 days, when sent to Baltimore, received his discharge and came home. After the war, as a result of the tortures inflicted during his imprisonment, he lost the sight of one of his eyes. Ransom Springer came from Maquoketa, and as you can see in this picture, he lost an entire arm. So I showed you the picture of the amputation blade. Possibly one was used on him as well. He's buried in Minnesota, but he was a Maquoketa, Jackson County native at one time. We found this story from an 1864 newspaper. All at the bottom says, "We understand he gives a gloomy account of the way in which our poor boys are treated in the rebel prisons." And so here's a list of all the Iowa soldiers that are buried at Andersonville Prison. 212 or 220, I believe it is. Oops. No, I gotta go back. Can't do that.
Right from the inside. Now, we've already talked about the unsanitary conditions here and the lack of accessible drinking water. Well, in mid-August of 1864, there was a heavy rainstorm, and right here at this very spot, there was a spring that gushed out of the hillside, and they ended up calling this spot Providence Spring. So the word Providence literally means the protective care of God. If we go in here and look, in I think 1901, some of the ex-prisoners that were here at Andersonville erected this little pavilion because this was a transformative moment in their life. And look what it says here. In the midst of all that they had gone through, or in spite of all that they had gone through, they have Lincoln's words, with charity to all and malice toward none. If anybody had reason for hate or for malice, it was these people. And yet they chose forgiveness instead. Pretty powerful. Andersonville. Man, quite the place. I think for me, the most impactful spot was that Providence Spring. Just the realization that these men, in the worst situation and in the most hopeless place that you could possibly imagine, still knew that God was taking care of them and He was providing for them. I would think that anybody that was at this place walked out a transformed man and didn't live another day of their life without thinking about this place and thinking about how, in spite of how awful it was, God was merciful and saw them through it. Man, oh man. Well, that was Andersonville. For now, we're getting ready to head over to the National Cemetery for Andersonville, but that'll be in the next video.
Carpenters at Elmira worked feverishly constructing wooden boxes trying to keep up with the large number of Confederates who forfeited life needlessly in a land with ample provisions. From a prison population of 10,000, nearly 3,000 identified and neatly arranged stones mark the final resting place of deceased prisoners in Woodlawn Cemetery. In charge of managing the cemetery was a black man and runaway slave, John Jones, who buried the defenders of slavery with the care and dignity he believed all people deserved. Nothing remains of Elmira Prison but the well-kept Confederate section of Woodlawn Cemetery, along with its Confederate memorial. The beauty and orderly grounds reflect the compassion of a caretaker who saw only young men robbed of life so early. In the same cemetery, John Jones rests in peace, not far from the Southerners for whom he bestowed the utmost respect in death. Marching from the train depot along an old wagon trail, hundreds of Yankee prisoners entered a brand new stockade in Georgia, feeling fortunate at being transferred from the deprivations on Belle Island. Any feeling of good fortune soon vanished. One of every 3 prisoners entering the Andersonville military prison never saw home again. but instead claimed space in the burial grounds that eventually exceeded the overall acreage of the prison itself. Stepping off the trains, they never imagined their new home was destined to be recorded in the annals of history as a stain on American decency and one of the saddest tragedies ever perpetuated on American soil. Soldiers were herded like farm animals into a barren 26-acre stockade with no shade. Upon entering the corral, Confederates issued no shelter for protection from the rain or the hot Georgia sun, no soap for washing, and no utensils for cooking. The small stream running through the camp, serving as both their toilet and drinking water, proved wholly inadequate for the sustenance of life. Excessive numbers of men without adequate latrines or means for defecating transformed Andersonville into a large cesspool, creating a stench that drifted on the air for miles around. Under the command of General John Winder, the population rose to an astounding 33,000 prisoners until Sherman's advance on Atlanta in September of 1864 forced most able prisoners to be relocated to other prisons. From that point on, Andersonville mostly served as a hospital for the critically sick prisoners unable to travel. In the stockade's 14-month existence, 13,000 Union soldiers took their last breath, but over 10,000 died in only 5 months over the wretched summer of 1864. Starvation, disease, and exposure killed 100 men per day during the month of August in the grossly overcrowded prison. When the wagons carried the skeletal remains to the cemetery, the burial details laid the naked and deceased prisoners in the trenches shoulder to shoulder without any coffins, leaving today's stone markers only inches apart. One of the last remaining soldiers to leave Andersonville on April 17, 1865, Corporal William Ziegler, later recalled the heart-wrenching scene.
Finally, the few that were left were ordered out. I looked back, and not one living soul remained in the enclosure. The empty prison and the standing stockade seemed like some grim monster, grinning with hatred because it had not taken the lives of the few who were left. As I stood outside the gate, I couldn't repress the tears as they ran down my hollow cheeks. I thought of the mothers, wives, and sisters in some far-off northern home, praying and awaiting the return of their loved one, but their bodies were moldering into dust.
At the turn of the 19th century, individual states began honoring their fallen soldiers at Andersonville. In the cemetery, as well as the stockade area, striking monuments pay tribute to those who suffered and died alone in a faraway land. The peace and serenity that permeate the pine forest of today bear little resemblance to the horrific scenes that defiled the same ground so many years ago. No piece of land in American history saw more death and misery than the deadly grounds at Andersonville Prison. After 4 years of bloody warfare, the end of the traumatic war between the states seemed certain when Richmond finally fell to Union forces early in April 1865. An elated President Lincoln walked through the streets of the captured Southern capital on April 4th, knowing the curtain was finally falling on the Confederacy. Soldiers north and south cheered the end of a long and gruesome war that went on far longer than anyone predicted. But none welcomed the merciful end more than the thousands of ailing prisoners in the squalid prison camps. The prison gates swung open, allowing those capable of walking to march to the train depots for the long journey home. Frail prisoners close to death and too weak to travel remained behind in nearby hospitals. For them, dreams of home went unfulfilled. Prisoners boarded congested trains and covered the decks of steamboats waiting to transport them to loved ones and life after war. Men cheered, some laughed, others cried uncontrollably, and those still able to dance carried on in delight at their coming reunion with family. Not all realized their hope of a blissful reunion. Rail cars and hospital ships carrying severely afflicted prisoners unloaded lifeless bodies at various stops along the way of men who came so close to home, but lost their struggle en route. In Richmond, Nurse Phoebe Pember expressed shock and horror after witnessing prisoners passing through the capital city in a frightful condition and wondered how civilized people and humanity ever allowed such a travesty to befall fellow human beings.
Can any pen or pencil do justice to those squalid pictures of famine and desolation, to those gaunt, lank skeletons with the dried yellow flesh? Living and dead were taken from the flag of Truth's boat, not distinguishable save from the difference of care in moving them. When we review the past, it would seem that Christianity was but a name, that the atonement had failed, and Christ had lived and died in vain.
For returning prisoners of war so racked with disease, the dying continued unabated in the months and years after gaining their freedom. Although the echo of gunfire fell silent and the killing on the battlefields halted, a fight to regain any semblance of health was lost for gravely ill soldiers whose constitution declined well beyond recovery. For many, the fight ended quickly. Barely recognizable to family and friends at their homecoming, they promptly died. The immense joy families felt at welcoming home a returning loved one soon dissolved into anguish as the number of widows of former prisoners continued to grow in the post-war years. Orphan children of deceased prisoners joined the fatherless children of battle casualties at the many needed orphanages built after the war. Sick prisoners who quickly died after the war fall outside the parameters of the official war statistics and thus aren't included on the death roll of 56,000 prison dead. A precise number of men whose death may be a direct result of a foul Civil War prison will never be known. Seeking justice for death on such a massive scale, the North rounded up those responsible. Captain Henry Wirz, the commandant at Andersonville, was tried and hung for his part. The only other commandant put on trial, Major John G., prison keeper of Salisbury Prison, was found innocent. The most despised man in the North, Jefferson Davis, spent 2 years as a prisoner in Fortress Monroe before feeling softened, and he was released without ever being charged. Not a single Northern official faced scrutiny for the retaliation and malicious conduct that transpired in Union camps where equally large numbers of Confederates died in a land of abundance. All the brave young Americans who answered their country's call, whether North or South, are all dead and gone now. Their impact on the course of American history lives on. Peach orchards, apple orchards, and bucolic farmlands that once staged bloody battles now stand as living monuments to the gallant participants who sacrificed all for a cause. Splendid bronze statues grace the rolling hills and meadows of the present-day battlefields to honor the heroic efforts of an individual or to mark the spot where a famed regiment made a glorious charge. Beautiful monuments in numerous cemeteries commemorate the prison dead who gave all for their country, but are seldom visited and draw much less attention from the throngs of tourists that visit the famous fields of battle. These noble soldiers are no less a hero than those soldiers who died on the battlefield. Just as regiments reunited in the post-war years for reunions, ex-prisoners of war sharing a common bond gathered to remember comrades who lost their lives in prison. In 1907, at the dedication of the Connecticut Monument at Andersonville, a former prisoner stood in front of the crying boy figure and spoke eloquently in a stirring tribute to those prisoners of war who died in captivity. Sergeant Robert Kellogg rose up before the gathering of aging vets and remembered those who died a long way from the theater of war with little salutation or reverence. He bemoaned the unassuming manner in which so many equally patriotic men died in obscurity in a cramped and filthy prison rather than falling on the battlefield. With words that may have pertained to the many brave American prisoners who surrendered their lives in all wars, past or present, he told the crowd, "It was not in the heat of battle that these men gave up their life. No cheer of victory roused them as their souls took flight. But in the loneliness of a multitude, with only a comrade by their side, within an enemy's line under a hostile flag,
Those are the other sides of the Iowa Monument. And on one side of the monument, in that picture, you will see the names of all the Iowa veterans that are buried there. And the story of the monument is it was created from the granite in Montello, Wisconsin.
Is that Shiloh? Is that Shiloh?
No, that was Andersonville.
Oh.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling past. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and dance. I have read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring glass. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel written burnished rows of steel. As ye deal with my contemners, so with you my grace shall deal. That the hero born of woman crushed the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
Awesome.